It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today. This is one of the most exciting days of the year for us. You've heard, I think, the best possible introduction to the whole department's vision from Jim, and I'm going to try to fill in one part that has to do with what I and a number of colleagues here, as well as in related areas of MIT, the proximity with the computer science and AI lab across the street, for example, is central to what we're doing here. We're interested in this research program I'm going to tell you about in intelligence. It's a science of intelligence, but it's also fundamentally an engineering discipline. We're reverse engineering how the brain works. The question of, think about email, this thing you take for granted. How does that work? Every single thing your brain does, you only really become aware of it when it stops working. And we want to understand how it actually works at all those scales. And one of the main ways we test our knowledge and we make it useful is by taking that reverse engineering knowledge and embedding it into various kinds of machine and artificial systems to try to make more human-like forms of machine intelligence. Now, again, it's an exciting time to be doing this because of both progress over the last couple of decades that we can build on, like since the time I was a student here, and also the biggest questions open going forward. Let me start off with what's basically a success story. Over the last couple of decades, a paradigm for understanding intelligence has emerged, and it's incredibly powerful. It's also limited, and our current work is about going beyond this. But let me say let me establish the starting point. It's a view that equates intelligence very much with a kind of adaptiveness or learning in a very broad sense. And learning here means something like statistics on a very grand scale. So, we've all heard these days in the news and probably in many of our actual working lives about big data and the ability to take massive amounts of data and find structure that's predictive and actionable. And this is a powerful way to think about what the brain does. You can think about information coming in through your senses. It's the biggest of big data. Your retina has about 1 million retinal ganglion cells. It's like a million pixels encoding the flux of visual experience onto the surface of your brain. Similarly, think about the cochlea getting the sound waves that you're getting from me right now. And in this masses of data, you can think of what the brain is doing as trying to find structure, like correlations, clusters, anything that can be exploited for prediction. The math of finding structure in data can be implemented in neural networks, which originally, when they were developed in the mid-1980s, are simple, vaguely neuron-inspired models of computation, where these nodes and arrows are vaguely like neurons and their connections. And that math actually has some correspondence with what goes on inside the real connections between neurons. For example, the phenomenon of long-term potentiation, how a synapse, the connection between neurons, changes its strength in response to experience. And this math can explain what goes on inside that connection between single cells and can be used to predict behavior in humans, mice, and many other animals. And in some sense, the very same math is responsible for a lot of these applications that have made a difference in our daily life on the technology side. Jim mentioned some of these. You could view all of these things here as in a sense, AI technologies. Systems like, for example, face detection that we take for granted in our digital cameras and our photo sharing systems, or recent systems that have been built into cars that, if you don't have these yet, you'll have them very soon, systems that can detect other cars and pedestrians that work so well that they pass what I would call the lawyer test, right? The lawyers for these car companies have let these systems be directly wired into the brake pedal, arguing that they will save many more lives and many more dollars in property damage than any possible error. They work really well. Or take Google's information retrieval system. You type in a question, you get a useful answer. We've heard of Watson. Jim mentioned that, the IBM system that beats the world's experts in Jeopardy. Siri, the speech language interface to your iPhone that works some of the time. Wolfram Alpha question answering system. All of these systems would surely impress the early founders of artificial intelligence, right? Like if you told Marvin Minsky or Alan Turing, let's say, that you could have a system like Google where you could type in any question and you'd get a useful answer searching all the world's knowledge like that, it's clearly some kind of an AI success. And yet none of these systems are intelligent. So what's missing? Well, here we have some thoughts on this, and this is what we're trying to do right now in a set of related initiatives. Jim mentioned the Intelligence Initiative, which is something that Tommy Poggio and I started organizing a few years ago, and where it's turned most recently into a new center that Tommy is heading up, a center for brains, minds, and machines that is garnering support both from some private sources, like, for example, from Google, as well as potentially from NSF. We're in the very final stages of an NSF competition, and confidential, nothing I can say here would be confidential. We're doing well, I'll say that. And we're trying to take a new take on these questions. We think the time is right to tackle really what human intelligence is really about, not just statistics and big data, although it starts off from that. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's missing and how we're going to fill in the pieces. But our center here has a number of related thrusts. The development of intelligence, looking at reverse engineering the first few years of cognition in infancy and early childhood, integration of intelligence across language and vision and action planning. At the heart is a notion of social intelligence, that it's not just about what goes on in your head, but how intelligence supports your interaction with others, and the brain circuits that support that. And at the middle is a set of enabling theoretical, mathematical, computational principles, like the math of finding structure in data, but more than that. To sum this up in terms of a set of slogans, it's about how we grow, how we think, how we interact, how we're implemented, and how it all works. And we think we're posed to make really fundamental progress on these problems on both the science and engineering side. To give you a sense for the gap and where we're targeting our efforts, let's go back to Google again, because Google is a phenomenal engineering achievement, and so it's easy, but it's also kind of easy to pick on. It's a good target. Take one of Google's language understanding abilities, which is maybe one of the more pedestrian ones you might think, spelling correction. So here's something. Can everybody read what you see on top? What does that say there? I mean, you can sort of pronounce it in a weird way, but you recognize that it's a weirdly misspelled version of the question, how does Google spelling correction work? And Google can recognize that too. It's amazing, right? We again have versions of that kind of seemingly magic spelling correction on our BlackBerries or our iPhones, and Google will even return a useful answer. But try this one here. What does this say? Sort of hard, very, very misspelled. How about this one? Right. Every one of you can read this fluently. Even those of you who aren't native speakers of English can read this fluently. Now, Google, not so much. Right? What's the difference? Well, Google does spelling correction by finding patterns of frequently co-occurring letters, frequent strings, so-called n-grams. And by taking all the text that basically has ever been digitized, Google is able to get a lot of useful information. But you don't just process language by looking for frequently co-occurring sets of letters. For you, it's about meaning. Words express concepts, and language puts concepts together into thoughts, propositions. And it's that ability to find meaning, to actually understand, and language and reading is just the tip of the iceberg. It's amazing how far you can push this ability to find meaning, even something as pedestrian as reading. Like, how about this? What does this say? What's going on there, right? This is a weird, yeah, you can read this. Google would be completely dumbfounded. You can't even enter this into a text box. And it shows that even in reading, it's not just about scanning over sequences of letters. You're using vision, your ability to move your eyes, your ability to plan actions. You're sort of formulating a whole new strategy for reading that you were never trained for before. Right, so what is this essential ability to make sense of the world? Well, maybe a more familiar place to study it, where a lot of research in our department is going on, and Jim mentioned this, is what you could think of as kind of scene understanding in the very general sense. So you look at scenes like this, like various physical scenarios or social interaction scenarios. You look at that workshop there, and you can recognize objects. There's a tire, there's a table, there's some roll of tapes on the rolls of tape on the back wall, there's a saw. But it's not just about recognizing what is where in vision, it's about understanding, say, the physics of the scene. So you know that there's all those objects that are stably supported on the table. If you were to bump the table a little bit, most of them would probably still be there. If you were to remove the table, they'd all come crashing to the floor. A bump on the table, though, it probably wouldn't do anything to the vise there. It might knock the tire over. You could imagine the tire rolling. The objects on the back wall, you understand that some of them can just be lifted right up. Others are probably rigidly attached. And throughout all these scenes, your brain is doing kind of automatic, unconscious, physical scene analysis. You take that scene of the house over there, and even if you're not a carpenter, you know which of those supports are which of those pieces of wood you could remove probably more likely without damaging the structural integrity of the house, which ones are not even attached at all, you could go and just pick up and take off without having to pry off. Or here's a scene from my local cafe across the street. The barista there described that as an accident waiting to happen. Somehow at a glance he knew that this dish bin here, you can't just go pick that up, or all those dishes are very precarious. They're going to fall over and cause a major disaster, at least by cafe standards. So you know you have to restack it. This is more on the social side. You look at these people, and you don't really know who they are, but you get a sense of how they're interacting, what their relationship is to each other, maybe what they want from the other person, maybe something about what they think. It's quite striking, this ability to grasp what we call the common sense core, this basic ability to understand the world in terms of physical objects, intentional agents, and their interactions, a kind of intuitive physics and intuitive psychology that your brain does all the time without thinking about it. This ability, I will argue, develops early in infancy. It's shared to some extent with other species, which means you can study it in animal brains using techniques of neurophysiology. But in humans, it is extended and enriched massively over the first few years of life as we start to understand language. So I started off talking about Google and language. And the point is that language, the ability to understand meaning in language, starts off with the ability of even a 9-month-old or a 12-month-old to understand these kinds of scenes. And that's what the meaning is actually grounded on. And across all of the different areas of cognition, we've come to understand how this basic intuitive physics and intuitive psychology binds everything together. So this is what we're trying to understand in our center here. What's the form and content of this knowledge? How is it used to make sense of our experience? How might it be learned over the first few years? And how might it work in the brain? And just to drive this point home, the developmental roots of this, you can study all the questions I'm talking about just looking at kids playing with blocks and playing with each other. And even simpler than that, and it's important for good scientific progress, for the kind of experiments we do, the kind of models we build, to boil things down to the simplest possible setting, take these very, very simple settings of dynamic visual scenes and ask yourself, what kind of meaning can you get here that isn't just a big data set? So here, you could see this as two balls moving on a green plane, but what kind of meaning do you see here? How would we describe what's actually going on? Anyone care to venture? Yeah, the blue ball is chasing, and the red one is? Yeah, kind of trying to flee. And it's not just these goals, but there's sort of beliefs. It looks like the blue ball has a kind of a slightly crazy false belief. He thinks he can fit through those little holes, which he can't, right? So you can perceive that just at a glance of that scene. Or here's a very famous video from the psychologists Heider and Simmel. That, by the way, the one on the left was studied with 13-month-old infants. So even very young infants can perceive that. But here's a sort of more complex thing, where again, you could see this as two triangles in a circle moving, but instead you see a whole story, right? Try to tell the story to yourself. It looks like the big one is maybe kind of bullying, beating up on the little one. The circle's kind of going into hide in there. Now, after having scared the little one away, the big one kind of makes his point, drives him away, goes in and, yeah, sort of cue the scary music, right? Don't worry, it ends happily, at least for two of the three shapes there. Okay, so what are you getting from in some sense, it's not big data, it's small data. It's just a couple of shapes moving around on a screen, but yet you have intuitive physics, intuitive psychology, you see these force interactions, you see what these things want or think, and you get kind of sociology and morality, like who's on whose side or who's good and who's bad. That's what we want to understand and reverse engineer. And if we can do that, think about the technology applications. There's many of them. For example, in education, for example, in prostheses for various kinds of brain disorders and development. I won't talk about autism here, but for example, Google is building a set of glasses which sort of can superimpose all sorts of things on the world. And imagine if you could build a kind of a social cognition prostheses that could give you the kind of social understanding, the same way that eyeglasses take a blurry image and bring it into focus. But here I'll just emphasize one in robotics, where this is something which, again, the federal government is making a big investment in, as is private capital and starting companies, because it's seen as really possibly the engine of future American competitiveness in manufacturing. Having robots that kind of do the same things that people can do, but really in interaction with people. So for example, Rod Brooks, who for a while was the head of the Computer Science and AI Lab, now has a startup company, again, explicitly focused on manufacturing robots that can interact and communicate and be taught by people the way another person would. Or for example, Jim mentioned Google self-driving cars. These are amazing things. They've driven, I think more than 100,000 miles in California under all different kinds of conditions. They're basically street legal. And in your lifetime, even in, say, a 10-year time frame, this is a real AI technology that will start to change our lives. But yet, they still don't have the intelligence of even, I hate to say it, your 16-year-old son or daughter who's learning to drive. There's a lot of ways in which they're more reliable. They don't drink and drive. They don't fall asleep. They always do what they're told. But they don't have this basic intuition about how the world works. So here's a quote from some of the engineer technical leads of that Google self-driving car project. The piece that's missing, this is what they need to focus on in the future, is not better radars or cameras or lasers, it's the intelligence behind them. we do a good job of detecting pedestrians at the side of the road, that's their cars already, but we don't yet have built in the kind of intuition for what a pedestrian might do. Knowing, for example, that a pedestrian who's walking along the sidewalk is likely to keep doing that. If the pedestrian, though, is walking sort of perpendicularly and coming to the edge of the road, there's a chance they might cross the road. It's going to depend on where they're looking. It's going to depend on whether they see you or not. Or, for example, they looked at a four-way stop intersection where there's subtle communication that goes on. Once you've come to a stop, how do you signal who's going to go? They realized after I think years of trying to work on these problems that they had to build in a sort of implicit communication negotiation that just wasn't obvious to them, but is obvious even to you the first time you start driving. Okay, so how do we do all this? Well, I only have about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I can't tell you everything. And you'll see more about this in later talks and breakout sessions. But I'll just tell you about one thing that I and some of our colleagues here have been doing. It's one mathematical idea that goes beyond big data and statistics, though it builds on it. It builds on probabilistic inference and dealing with uncertainty in data. But instead of doing statistics just on numbers or like spreadsheets of data, which is basically a way to think about the computational principles in earlier generations of AI systems as well as computational neuroscience, think about doing statistics on computer programs. Computer programs that allow you to model and simulate the world. Jim mentioned this idea that the brain is like a modeling engine, right? So we're trying to formalize that idea in computer programs that maybe the most familiar analogy isn't email, but a kind of simulation engine which is sometimes called a game engine. So many of you probably have things like this in your pocket, and whether you play games on your phone or it's just your kids who play games on your phones or your grandkids, what's at the heart of those games are things called game engines. This is a kind of software that game developers use to write games that allow you to richly interact with a virtual physical world. Maybe how many people have played Angry Birds? That's one example. But think about something where there's like 3D things and stuff is coming at you and shooting at you, or you're sort of building a city or a tower. There's all sorts of really compelling games like that. Or games where there's some kind of agents that you're interacting with, some so-called non-player characters who have a little intelligence and have to interact with you. At the heart of a game engine are a set of general computer programs for modeling physics, which is how a world state of objects moves from one state to a future state. It's like Newtonian mechanics that we all learned in high school, but kind of made sort of efficient, approximate simulations to do sort of a hack on Newtonian mechanics, to do it fast and cheap and almost good enough. Graphics, which are programs for taking a set of objects in a three-dimensional world and rendering images quickly. And then programs for, say, planning. So this is, again, something that's shared with robotics. Programs which take a model of the world, like what's where, and a set of goals, and plan a sequence of actions to rationally achieve some goal. And the math of physics, graphics, and planning simulations, we are doing statistics over that as a model of what's going on inside your head. So let me make this more concrete with just a bunch of demos, basically. To study how your brain is basically running a physics engine and doing statistics over that, we give people in an experiment a bunch of stimuli like these, just pictures of these stacks of blocks, and we might ask you to judge on a scale of 1 to 7, how stable are they? Go back to those scenes I showed you, the more kind of naturalistic scenes like in the cafe or the workshop table. And here you'll probably get a sense that, say, the one in the upper left is relatively stable, whereas these ones over here look like they could fall over under gravity at any moment. And we model that by saying your brain takes a sort of a snapshot of the world from this image, runs a couple of sort of approximate simulations on one of these physics engines, and then just kind of counts up the statistics of the different runs of that simulation. It's very much like the way a lot of modern simulation, like how do you predict the weather? You run up hundreds of thousands of simulations and sort of see what happens, and if in 80% of the simulations you get rain, you say there's an 80% chance of rain. That's how modern weather prediction works. And we say your brain does the same kind of thing, only with physics instead of the weather, and maybe it's only like 5 or 10 and not 100,000. And this allows us to build quantitatively predictive mathematical models of your intuitive physics sense. So just as an example of a data and model, we show people 60 of those towers, and then for each one we get a graded sense of how likely it is to fall under gravity. And we're plotting on this plot here, each plus is on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is what people think. Dots which are higher up mean things which are more likely to fall, like this red one over here, most people think is very precarious. And then the blue one over here, down in the lower corner, people think is very stable. And then on the x-axis is the model predictions. And you can see this model is able to predict with pretty high quantitative accuracy what people think on average for these towers. Now, if you're a psychophysicist or a psychologist, I hope you'd find this impressive, particularly if you're one of the reviewers of our paper, which has this under review right now. But what I want to impress on you and impress you on, hopefully, is, again, how this is really about common sense. It's not just about one task like this, but the infinite flexibility of what you can do. So think about all these questions you could ask about even these simple scenes, not to mention more complex natural scenes. Like, it's not just will the tower fall, but how much of it will fall? Or if it falls, which way will it fall? Or how far will the blocks fall? Or suppose you add in a force. It's not just gravity and friction that's right there, but say you bump the table. Will more red or blue blocks fall over? Or what if you bump this side rather than that side? Or what if they have different shapes or sizes? Or, think about counterfactual reasoning. What was the straw that broke the camel's back? Was it this block that I added that caused the tower to fall? Or suppose this one hadn't been present, would it still have fallen? Or think about reasoning about hidden properties, like which of these blocks are heavier or lighter than the others. So you can do all these judgments, and our model can do all of them too. To give you more of a sense of this, and just sort of how this kind of simulation engine can capture the whole spectrum of your common sense, let me give you another slightly stranger task. But again, you can all do this at a glance. So imagine now you bump this table. It's not just falling under its own, but you bump it hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor. Is it more likely to be red or yellow blocks that fall into the floor? What do you say, red or yellow? Good. Here? Yeah, here? Mm-hmm.
Try it and find out.
Keep going. I don't have all day. Okay, how about here? Here? Right, okay, so literally, I could give you an infinite number of these, right? I just made these in PowerPoint. But our model, what we think is going on in your head is something like this. This is a glimpse inside our model, which we think is capturing in your head. You run a simulation like this. You imagine bumping the table. That was a light bump. Now here's the same thing, but with a harder bump, a more forceful bump. Bump. Bigger bump. And basically the same thing happens. So you only have to do this approximately a couple of times to get a sense of what's going to happen. And that kind of model, you do a few little mental simulations like that, and again, it can quantitatively predict how people respond to a whole range of these different stimuli. We can just keep making it more complex. We can make the blocks bigger or smaller, so here some of the blocks are tall. We can add these rails. We can say, suppose it's bumped from this side or that side. So we give you extra information. Same thing still works. We can use this for action planning. So here's a task. It's kind of more like a video game where people are said your job is to knock more yellow than red blocks onto the floor, and you get to set the direction and magnitude of the force. So here's someone who set the bump like that, and you can see they won. Or here's another kind of game. Again, think about using your intelligence to build things in the world, like any kid does. We can now capture this kind of basic common sense of a child playing with blocks, where we say, suppose your job is to assemble these blocks so that they're stable. Then most of these are going to fall over in some way if you just depend on gravity, so you need to put on some glue or nails, and ask yourself, where do you need to attach glue or nails or tape or something to make this thing stable? You can answer that at a glance, and so can our model. And the very last thing I want to show you about is bring this back to not just intuitive physics, but intuitive psychology. This is really what we need to build a more useful notion of AI that can really interact with people, or if you want to think about building technologies that can assist people in social interaction if that is a difficulty that they're having. So how do we take this idea of sort of mental simulation, probabilistic analyses on programs in here? Well, again, here we have these models where instead of talking about a physics program, it's a planning program, a program that takes things you can't observe as the outside observer, like the mental states, the beliefs and desires of these agents, turns those into things you can observe, like their actions, how they move around, and then you're doing statistical inference to work backwards to make good likely guesses now at what beliefs and desires might have driven these actions. And I'll just show you one example of this thing in action before closing. Here's an instance from an experiment we've done, which is a little bit subtle, but I think once you see it, you'll get what's cool about this. So that scene up on the upper left is a little university campus, much like MIT here, where there's some walls, some buildings. And this is showing Harold, the hungry grad student, searching for his lunch. At MIT, along with many other campuses, we have these food trucks where you might have a Korean truck, that's the K truck, the Lebanese truck, that's L, there's the Mexican truck. In this world, there's 3 trucks, Korean, Lebanese, and Mexican. But there's only 2 parking spaces shown in yellow, and on different days, different trucks might be in different places. And sometimes one truck might not make it in at all. So what happens here, Harold comes out of his office one day. Let's see if I don't know if I have a pointer or you can just follow along. So Harold comes out here, where he can see the Korean truck, but he can't see what's on the other side of this building. So what does he do? He walks out here. He goes past the Korean truck. He goes around the corner. Now he can see that there's a Lebanese truck there, and he comes back to the Korean truck. And the question is, what's his favorite truck? Korean, Lebanese, or Mexican? Mexican, yeah, isn't that interesting? You can infer that his favorite truck was Mexican, and he was looking for it, right? And he didn't find it, and so he settled for his second best, right? And that's what our model does. I won't go into reading the graphs, you can probably guess, but our model makes the joint inference that his favorite truck was the one that isn't even present, and also that he was sort of optimistic. He thought it was there, otherwise it wouldn't have been worth going to look for. So, again, how do you do that? You might have heard of mirror neurons, these remarkable neural circuits in the brain, which in a monkey's brain, for example, where the monkey reaches for an apple and these neurons fire if it's a goal-directed action. This is going beyond this in a way that we don't necessarily know whether, for example, other animals can do this, although there's some suggestive evidence they can, but we don't yet understand the computations in neural circuits. But we're starting to get there because we have computational models at the levels of these probabilistic programs that can make inferences about what you want, thinking about not just where you move towards, but thinking about more fundamentally thinking about how the other person is thinking about the world, what they believe, even if it's different from reality. And as part of this intelligence initiative in the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, we're putting all of these things together into a new take on social cognition that really ties together all these levels, that ties together, sort of social perception in a movie, like the baseball player and the umpire shouting at each other, what we can study in infants, what we can study in human and animal brain circuits for perceiving the intentions of others, and describing this in math and embedding this in robots and other machine systems. So in conclusion then, I hope I've given you at least a taste of how we're starting to be able to tackle what was really a dream of early AI research and early cognitive science and neuroscience. Go back and read Alan Turing, go back and read any of the founders of our field, read the early psychologists. We all want to understand how common sense works. And as much as AI technologies and computer information technologies have advanced, they still don't have this yet. But we think we're now on the verge of being able to ask these basic questions about how human common sense works, how it arises, and even maybe how it works in the brain. And I've given you one taste of it in the kind of work that I do, modeling the brain as a simulation engine. But you're going to see a lot of other tools and techniques over the rest of today, and it's really putting all these together that are letting us make fundamental progress on these questions. Thanks very much.